Perfect. All good to go. Welcome everyone to round 5 of Australs. Unless anyone has any questions, I'd like to welcome up the first speaker of the affirming team to open the debate.
Just checking I'm audible again. Thank you. So in 3, 2, 1. States have an incredible amount of power in the status quo. They can lock you up. They can do all sorts of things to regulate the amount of tax you have. Importantly, we just think it's unnecessary. They also have the tool to control the very currency and the value of any item in an economy, any piece of interest rate, or how incredibly interconnected the world's financial instruments are. We think the world is better when those things are separated out a little more. 3 claims in what we think how setup works. Then we'll explain why governments manage fiat currency and regulate industries badly. And we'll explain the impacts of the low trust in these things, finally explaining why this is bad for US control of the world. Let's talk 3 things about what we think this change in decentralization is currently manifesting as and what it will continue to do so. The first is just the people's reliance on fiat currency, which is the currency that governments set themselves, like the Australian dollar, the US dollar, Those things are just less relied on in industries, relied on in everyday trade and bargaining and lots of stuff. Instead, we'll rely probably on something like crypto. The second is to point out there is a strong reliance on things like the US dollar in international trade, or back-end systems like SWIFT, which is how we transfer money between international banks and banks. Would rather there's just more options available in those contexts. So as a reserve currency, we use more than just US dollars. We relied on multiple different versions of SWIFT that might compete against each other. The final claim is we think a lot of the financial industries are reliant on single exchanges in single countries. That's to say the ASX is the Australian exchange, and basically, if you want to sell any sort of financial product like a share or derivative or a future, you have to do so on that exchange. We would rather there was multiple of these in each country, or there was something like, a dozen of these in the world that everyone access internationally. We'd probably point towards something like crypto exchanges as a good example of how this can occur and will continue to occur in the future. That hopefully clarifies setup. Let's explain first why governments are pretty bad at managing specifically fiat currencies, but also regulating things like exchanges. The first is, and I have like 6 mechanisms for this. The first is just to point out economics is deeply unknowable science. It is a fundamentally unresolved science, and one that is relatively young in its history. And that explains that the things you need to understand in economics are ones that are poorly understood. There's just too many variables. There's just too many people reliant on these variables, which means human behavior is deeply irrational and regularly incredibly unmodelable, which just means we can understand broad swaths of what happens in an economy. But governments are almost always surprised by something, and it's often something much larger than you think it is. Every time there's been a sort of like a crash in a government or a crash in a currency value or something like that is an indication that governments have misunderstood something and missed something. And this means even in their best case scenario where, a government is well funded and has access to good economists and actuaries and stuff like that, they still make a large amount of mistakes. There's a lot of context in the world where they do not have access to those sorts of expertise. Second, it's just to say governments, just because of these sets of this mechanism above, don't know what they don't know. So they very rarely go to explore new pieces of knowledge. And even if that knowledge is available, there's very little competition forcing governments to make these decisions well. That's to say, if you manage your currency or you manage your interest rates as a reserve bank, there's no one telling you you're doing that job wrong, because there's no alternative institution that might benefit from pointing that out. There's no actors that have the knowledge and capacity to point that out. But again, even if that knowledge is pointed out, the average person is unable to weaponize that in the political process. So this team can't rely on democracies, because if someone gets up and critiques the Reserve Bank and is like, well, you're doing quantitative easing slightly wrong or something like that, that is jobbily goop to the average person, which means they can't take that into their decision when they try and push politicians to change certain things, which means we don't get change in those contexts. The fourth thing is to point out the status quo bias by both government elected and non-elected institutions, to say they often focus on the incorrect set of problems. So even if you believe all of economics is understandable, they're unlikely to focus on the correct things, because they're likely to focus on, inflation is a bit of a problem at the moment, but we'll fail to deal with maybe underlying economic growth in the future, which explains why even if when we do respond in broadly correct ways, like how we respond to the GFC, we're likely to respond in deeply unperfect ways, which means we're likely to miss some of these problems by looking at the incorrect problems. And finally, it's just that people are likely to be confused by any technicalities that occur, which means people are likely to instead just attempting to have these discussions in public, they're likely to attempt to have these discussions privately, because they understand the average person does not understand this. And that means it's deeply untransparent, which means even the few amount of people, again, in next best case scenario, who do understand the economy enough, understand interest rates or currency enough, are unlikely to get that information because, say, the Reserve Bank feels no incentive to explain this to them. Finally, and most problematically for this negative team, people just have a set of political interests. As politicians, you're likely to get punished when interest rates are higher. That is deeply unpopular because the vast majority of people have mortgages. That might, in fact, be the correct economic response to that situation. It might be the correct way to manage your currency or regulate your exchange, but it's deeply unpopular because on the most base level, that says my life is more expensive because I pay more at the mortgage. Which means the actions that are good for an economy and the actions that are popular are unlikely to be particularly well related. Which means, again, even if this negative team explains they are correct in a reasonable amount of context, it is not enough in this debate because there is obviously there is a reasonable amount of context to do this very badly. What is the effect of these 6 mechanisms? That just means you're likely to manage an economy incorrectly. And I want to note here that in lots of debates, we're like, well, they kind of do something good enough, so that's enough for, like, for us to say, well, the government's doing a good thing. I want to note the incredible scale that occurs when you fuck up an economy. Like, if there's a 100% perfect decision, the difference between 100 and 90% perfect is like thousands of people's jobs. It is thousands of dollars of people's wealth. Incorrect decisions that are even slightly incorrect are incredibly detrimental in economics because the scale is so large and because everything is likely to interrelate. So a small inefficiency is likely to snowball and get worse and worse. So we do need to manage economies incredibly well. We are likely to make these mistakes wrong. Why is this likely to be better in a crypto world? The first thing is just there is so much more competition. There is likely to occur a number of different people managing currencies or just like computer generation doing so. There's likely to be a competition between the establishment we explain is problematic in the status quo and a series of new, say, cryptocurrencies or exchanges or fiat currencies. It is in those contexts where even if you believe a large amount of people in this debate still rely on fiat currencies, still rely on playing into the government world, that government world has to compete with other people more. And this is the biggest claim for the affirmative team and the biggest win. It's just even if you also believe that cryptos make mistakes and can't resolve some of the problems identified before of government mismanaged, you do so opting into which option you prefer. Which means even if everyone has a 1% risk of some problem occurring, so one crypto is likely to have inflation, the other's likely to have deflation, the other one's likely to have poor economic growth, you can hedge against that risk by opting into multiple different ones or picking which risk you would prefer. We think this fundamentally gives people far more agency than exists in the status quo because you're forced to live within the world of the government, which I think explains naturally how we're going to get to our next argument around how people are likely to respond to this bad mismanagement and the lack of trust they have in the system. Which means they're likely to do things to actively opt out of systems and do things like buy gold, which is economically unbelievably unproductive. They're not willing to invest or transition their money, say, between one country or another, or do FDI as a business in a different country, because you simply do not trust the institutions that transfer that cash. We don't trust that an investment will be worth the same amount when it eventually occurs and it eventuates in a different currency, just because those things are likely to change so rapidly. We think people do less economic activity when there's instability and lack of confidence, and that occurs when government mismanage problems. But principally, it's just unclear why governments have this control already. I already identified at the start of the speech that governments have an awful lot of power. It's unclear why they need more. But importantly, this is not something we actively gave governments the right to. We didn't consent to this. We didn't decide this was a good idea. It was just a kind of default thing that happened historically, which means it's deeply arbitrary, which means obviously it's not maybe not actively bad, but even there is a large burden on this team to prove we should allow this right to be maintained. We should allow these countries to do so already. Finally, incredibly quickly, the US has a lot of control over the world because when you have an unstable currency, you pick up the US dollar because it's the most stable one. And this gives an automatic advantage to the US companies because they're able to do transactions without having to exchange their currencies. We think the fact that US companies can go in and have an incentive to crash at different countries, they'll likely have an incentive to crush domestic control. It's deeply unfair to those countries and deeply unfair to their sovereignty. We regret the power the US has. We regret the power all governments have, most of all. Very proud to affirm.
Thank you very much for that speech. To open the case for the negating team, I'd like to welcome up first Neg.
Sorry for that delay, just setting up my paper. Am I audible? Cool. I think the core problem with that affirmative case is one of comparison. They point out that there are a bunch of problems with financial systems in a status quo that act imperfectly. This is the exact observation that crypto bros make when they opt into systems of decentralized finance, which ultimately shake out to be scams that they are unaware of. They literally are unable to access their money, and in many cases lose it all when the forms of decentralized finance that they buy into have hourly boom and bust cycles or completely fall apart with absolutely no incentive for regulation. And that's the second thing. There is, at least in the status quo of systems of traditional finance, things like the Reserve Bank, there are central banks, there are financial regulators. By very definition in decentralized finance, these things don't exist. There's absolutely no capacity or very little capacity to regulate these things, which explains why when the affirmative team gets up in this debate and refuses to actually explain how these systems are functional in the first place, that they're not scams that cause people to lose money, that consumers don't necessarily, that consumers engage in them well, then they haven't fulfilled a burden that's crucial for them delivering anything in this debate. I'm going to do some setup and then I'm going to make 4 arguments. I think it's important to just ground the question of this debate a little bit further, because many of the arguments that are made by the affirmative refer to the benefits of decentralizing stores of value from the financial system into some sort of decentralized or crypto universe. Notably though, decentralized finance is not things like Bitcoin, it is not things like Ethereum, it is not alternative ways to store currency value. It is in fact derivatives markets, insurance markets, stock markets. That is distinct in this debate because stores of value occur in the real economy, and then decentralized finance is a different part of the economy. The reason that this debate refers to supporting an advent is many of the cases we're talking about in this debate just don't exist yet. Like there aren't decentralized financial markets of things like stock markets or currency exchanges or derivative markets. So when they get up in this debate and they're like, oh, well, people can kind of now express that they are worried about the values of currencies. They make some arguments about, central banks investing in gold in a way that's unproductive. The debate's entirely symmetric because these refer to things that store value, which is notably not decentralized finance. Many people use elements of store value for exchange on real market, but DeFi is distinct from that. I hope that setup is clear. If it's not, clarification will come at Bella, who actually understands finance. First argument, the vast majority of these things are established as scams and they don't get off the ground in the first place. People lose an immense amount of money. The piece of context just to ground this is the world of decentralized finance and cryptocurrency is rife with people who are seeking to make a quick buck. They are scams. These are essentially, in many cases, modern day get-rich schemes because they work like Ponzi schemes. You can have a massive increase really quickly, which massively increases your net worth if you establish a new decentralized finance system, but those subsequently collapse later. But that's fine for you because you've made all your money, you can get out in the first place. And there's very little incentive not to do that in a decentralized finance system, right? Because you are literally in a decentralized finance system by its very definition and character, not identified. You are a set of numbers, you're a set of code, your name, your personal identity is not attached to it at all. So there's every incentive in the world to exploit the fact there are many people who think they have lots of financial knowledge, but do not, in fact, have enough to engage well, exploit them, make a very, very unstable and essentially a scam Ponzi scheme in your decentralized finance system. Get out, get all your money and leave. For instance, examples like the collapse of ApeCoin, where this benefited a select group of individuals but caused thousands or millions of people to lose money that they had invested into that exemplified this. Secondly, we would say the people who are often invested in creating the next DeFi crypto product even if they intend to do so well, are often delusional because they suffer from an optimism bias, because they are very quickly corrupted by the fact their net worth increases by millions in the process of a couple of days, because they're positively reinforced by other people around them. What this fundamentally establishes in this debate is decentralized financial systems are unstable because there's very little incentive to not run them as scams, that people lose all their money. There's every incentive in the world to exploit people so that they lose their money. So overwhelmingly, the impact of them in this debate is not a stable check and balance on the traditional finance system, as affirmative wants you to believe they are. They are, in fact, a non-functional element of the financial economy that causes many everyday people who think they're engaging well to do so badly. And that leads me on to the next idea, which is even if people are well-intentioned and think they know, the consumers simply are unable to consent. The kinds of consumers that opt into, in the first instance, decentralized financial systems are people who think they have enough knowledge, they think they're pretty smart, maybe they've invested in cryptocurrency value systems, and that they're really successful in that, and they decide to take the next step into decentralized finance. They're sold on the narrative that it's the future, that it's the cutting edge, but they lack fundamental literacy and ultimately are not sufficiently able to consent because this is a totally novel concept. It's actually pretty difficult to even access the knowledge that would be able to allow you to make a decision well about engaging in a decentralized financial market because they are super elaborate. They're very hard to actually assess whether or not something is, in fact, a scam or a fraud. And that is by its very nature, because it is decentralized, because it is de-identified, it is very complicated. And because of the fact that we are not talking about real aspects of the market, things that store value, we are instead talking about abstraction, things like derivative markets, things like insurance markets. So even if there is good implementation of this, people don't choose the good implementations of this because they simply don't know how to, and they are incentivized to choose things that probably make them wealthy faster, but are in fact not stable financial systems. Finally, governments cannot protect people with regulation. Firstly, that's because of its design. Because it's not a centralized exchange, the point of a decentralized financial system, the premise by which it defines itself is that it cannot be regulated, that it exists outside of traditional scope. But even if it can be regulated, governments are notoriously terrible at this. They're not optimal at regulating because they often just lack the knowledge of how to do it, because they're usually old farts who don't know how code works, and so just dispositionally unable to do so. But really, I would say nobody really knows how these things could be effectively regulated, because in many cases, they don't already exist, and they quickly go under boom and bust cycles. The upshot of this is governments have no way to regulate and protect people, and when these systems collapse, they have huge externalities. They cause recessions. They cause derivative markets in the traditional financial system to suffer because of the flow-on impacts of it. Things like FTX, which is notably even a centralized exchange, which you might be able to regulate a little bit, still cause many, many people to lose all of the value they've invested into these systems. That's enormously harmful. I didn't get onto the fourth argument, which is about the harms of people using crypto more. Bella will start that more at second, but I'm really proud to negate.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. To continue the case for the affirming team, I'd like to welcome up the second speaker. Thank you very much for that speech. To continue the case for the negating team, I'd like to welcome up the second speaker.
Can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to spend the first 2 minutes of this speech explaining why virtually the entirety of Jordyn's speech is going to be unimportant in this debate. Because the problem with that competition argument is that it is contingent on government bodies believing that DeFi is a good thing, but that DeFi also being reputable and universally used. The only way in which competition works and the only way in which governments and the RBA are going to legitimize something to be competition is if everyone buys into it and is if they think it is something worth competing with. I'm going to explain to you in this speech the 3 contingencies that affirmative team operates on and why none of them are likely to be true. I'm then going to do 3 things. The first is talk about risk hedging. The second thing is talk about scams and vulnerable people. And the final thing is talk about the ability of governments to regulate. Let's start with the 3 contingencies that are on governments and companies in order for this to be a reputable form of competition. First of all, it needs to be deemed significant competition to the RBA. I think it is unlikely that DeFi, particularly in its beginning infant stages, is deemed something legitimate enough by the RBA for them to compete with it. Second of all, it is contingent on that DeFi working successfully. We tell you a myriad of reasons at Oscar why people are incredibly distrusting of this kind of thing, why it causes a huge amount of panic when you lose a lot of money really quickly, but also why you need an extent of financial literacy to opt into DeFi. And by virtue of a lot of people not having that financial literacy, it means that people don't opt into it. What you should believe at the end of this is that the only way in which this team is able to claim their one benefit, the only benefit they bring you is competition, is if they are able to prove that everyone opts into this DeFi, that this DeFi is something that is actually reputable and legitimate. So obviously it is silly to support something that is potentially a scam, that is potentially a huge money loss for a lot of people, to increase competition to big FIs that are doing a good enough job under the status quo. First of all, let's talk about risk hedging, because this affirmative team tells us that increasing DeFi increases competition, it increases agency, and it increases hedging against risk. First of all, they tell us, well, the RBA are now going to do better. I'm just unsure what that doing better actually looks like, because this team doesn't tell us any more than just when the RBA has to compete, they do better. But in what ways do they actually do better? Because we on Side Negative would argue that they are already doing pretty good. It is a good thing that the RBA has political incentives, because that means that they are forced to do things that act in the best interests of everyone by virtue of the fact they are politically motivated. Jordyn then says, well, for example, when telco was privatized, that was a good thing because it increased the efficiency. My sister in Christ, this is obviously silly because telco was privatized and regulated at the same time. That is not a good analogy for your team, because telecommunications are highly regulated under the status quo. Something can be both private and government regulated. This unique situation of DeFi is private and non-government regulated. If you can point to an analogy of that, I salute you, my friend. Second of all, let's talk about hedging. Obviously, hedging exists under the status quo because you can still do things like store value in cryptocurrency on places like Binance and places like CoinSpot. But note the fact that because DeFi isn't the norm in the status quo, it gives you an incentive not to hedge all of your income on these kind of things. So maybe you hedge some of your income in crypto. However, when DeFi is everywhere, you hedge all of your income in cryptocurrency. And the problem with that is that when something like FTX happened, you are so monumentally screwed over because you have no safety net or checks and balances. We give people the option to opt into that kind of thing if they are financially literate, if they are liquid enough to do that. But we don't make it the norm, and we allow them to do regular good old savings with the National Australia Bank. Thirdly, though, DeFi is just a really bad way to hedge your money. And that's just because cryptocurrency works in a boom and bust market such that pretty much all coins go up and then all coins go down. Like, there's a huge correlation between every form of coin. E.g., when Ethereum goes up, so does Bitcoin. When Ethereum goes down, Bitcoin also goes down. So it's actually a terrible way to diversify. Second of all, let's talk about scams and vulnerable people, because I think that this is probably the worst part of Jordyn's speech, unfortunately. She says, well, people don't fall into crypto scams because people are able to realize when things are scams, but also the more likely type of scam is like you're messaging on Facebook and you give someone your information. First of all, both of these things can be true. There can be the type of scam that Jordyn is talking about, and there can be crypto scams. Why are crypto scams actually incredibly popular? First of all, the kind of people that create cryptocurrency scams are incredibly intelligent and have access to a huge amount of capital, which means that they are able to lure you in a really smart and manipulative way, because they can do things like show you previous scraps of other coins that are similar to theirs, but not exactly the same, that have worked for other people. But second of all, scam, I think in this debate is being used in a way that is not traditional, such that the scams that we're talking about are like, people maybe are well-intentioned when they create these coins. But the problem is that crypto is such a volatile thing that something cannot be a scam, but you still lose a whole bunch of money for it. So by virtue of the fact that crypto changes value almost every single minute, it means that you can invest in something today, $1,000, and tomorrow it is worth $1. So it's not a scam. It just means that people get screwed over by the process of how cryptocurrency works. Thirdly, let's talk about the ability of government. This affirmative tells us three things. The first is that economics is an unknowable science, and that means that people don't focus the other thing they tell us is that like governments don't focus on the correct things because they have political incentives, etc. Firstly, obviously economics is an unknowable science. That's not a reason to stop trying. As soon as we opt into DeFi as the central method of banking, that is basically like saying economics and financial regulation, that is too hard, we will just give up. That is obviously incredibly silly. But second of all, by their own logic of saying something like, if the RBA goes wrong 1 out of 100 times, the impacts of that are really bad. Like, I actually could not agree more. The impacts of it are really bad. But the problem is when you do something like DeFi, the chances of those impacts happening are astronomically increased, and the impacts, as they themselves describe it, are cataclysmic. The reason why it is far worse when you're operating under DeFi is because there is no one to slap on the wrist, there is no accountability, but most importantly, there is no way to get your money back. And the reason that's true is because you don't have things like a proof of stake when something is DeFi, because you aren't able to show that you invested in that because everything is so anonymous, because it is decentralized and unregulated. So that means that at least if the RBA fucks up and you lose a bit of money, the RBA is accountable and the government is accountable. And a lot of people have experienced a similar thing because they're all invested in the same thing. Under their side, everyone is invested in something different. And when you have your hands in a million different pies and 3 of them suddenly sink, you are alone and there is no one to help you. What's the most important thing to realize at the end of side negative? It is that finance is one of the most important tools in the economy. When you just suddenly decide that it is no longer worth regulating, you leave millions of people abandoned, you leave millions of people up creek without an oar. That is something that we are totally against. DeFi is ludicrously silly. We are absolutely proud to oppose it.
Posen, thank you very much for that speech. To continue the case for the affirming team, I'd like to welcome up the third speaker.
Awesome, just checking that I can still be heard. Sick. I'm going to lead this speech with 2 clear wins, and they're clear wins because the negative team, either has chosen not to engage or has engaged very little with like clear points that Tom brings up from his first speaker's speech. The first thing I'm going to lead with, which is a very, very clear win with a ginormous impact on this debate, is the power this gives to the US dollar and therefore the US and American companies to gain power over the developing world. They give no responses to the material that comes out in Tom's speech, which is that when you have unstable domestic currencies, which he mechanizes in terms of like why governments are unlikely to be able to like regulate their own economies and their own currencies particularly well. The choice that countries make in these instances is often to use the US dollar as the stable thing that they now choose to use as like a alternative currency within their country. Now, this is incredibly important, has very, very bad impacts for the countries that choose to do this, and obviously particularly useful impacts for the US dollar. Firstly, that your economy is then fucked by the US government's choices, right? Potentially the US government wants their dollar to become relatively strong or relatively increased in value in order to get cheaper imports, because it's an import economy in general, which means that if you want to export stuff to the rest of the world, you're totally fucked, because your only alternative to rely on is this dollar that has incredibly different interests, and the US government does not consider the interests of your own economy, because obviously considering the interests of its own economy. But the second thing is it means that US companies have a comparative advantage when they want to enter into your economy. That is, if US dollar is accepted in your economy to a great degree, because that is the alternative, it means that they do not need to use exchange rates or use alternative ways of paying there, which is how you get stuff like the monopolization of food companies in Latin America by American companies. And it means that these governments then become largely controlled by American and foreign national interests. Obviously, this means that the US doesn't even need to choose to intervene in these instances. It is merely the fact that their dollar is considered to be the most stable in the world that causes these harms to come in the first place. And because Tom explains to you that governments are unable to accurately regulate their own economies, for just like structural reasons as to not knowing enough what they need to know about and political incentives and stuff like that, this means that inevitably these countries are screwed over. That changes when it is a neutral currency that no single country has an advantage over, as opposed to the US, which gives the US government outside and companies outsized influence in the developing world. That is obviously a clear win for affirmative already. I think we can win the debate on that alone. Secondly, then, in terms of competition on stock markets and things, because if they want to make this stuff like the finance being like derivative markets and stock exchanges and stuff like that, it's obviously much, much better, because status quo, you have a monopolization of these sorts of things, right? Tom and Jordyn tell you that most countries only have like one different stock market that you can do on. There are a bunch of things that having competition in this area could decrease. One of them is fees that you have to pay for transactions. The second one is security of these transactions, to make sure that countries' national stock exchanges have to become secure because they actually have competitors with them at the same time. The third thing is the speed and efficiency of exchanges that are occurring upon them. All of these things obviously, again, have massive implications for domestic economies, but notably at the same time, the ASX and every single other national stock exchange would still exist at the exact same time that these alternatives do. So if you believe any of their pushes that like the regulation is the best, you still have that regulation under our side. But we get the advent of these things, which cannot exist under their side of the world, because that's the wording that they chose to play with, right? The advent of these things means you have that competition, means you push the AXS and other regulated things that they care about so much to becoming better, to having lower fees, to having better security, to having better efficiency, and thus you get all the financial benefits on that, right? Remember, though, that they kind of try to imply at times in their speech that the government is bad at regulating these things, which could also really presumably means that the ASX is not great, or any of those other alternatives also aren't great. So these alternatives are probably going to push them to become better at regulation as well. At the end of this, again, obviously that means a lot more efficiency in most economies around the world, because you have the other options to play with, and you still get the supposedly better options that they want to talk to you about in the first place. You just get the alternative. Okay, now that I've shown you that we clearly win on those two metrics, what I think have large and outsized impacts on the global economy, I'm going to kind of talk about some of their stuff that's more like, oh, the everyday person is going to become scammed, or they're not going to understand how this works because they don't trust it. The first thing I kind of want to note here, right, is they just kind of ignore a lot of the contextualization that Tom gives in his speech when they're talking about crypto being particularly unstable, right? Which is like, oh yeah, probably ApeCoin is more unstable than the Australian dollar itself, right? But we're going through a crisis of inflation right now. Like, I think it was the Turkish currency that is inflated by like 100% over the past couple of months. Hyperinflation has been a problem in many countries around the world. Many countries' governments are incredibly corrupt, which means their economies are incredibly unstable as well, which means that just saying crypto is unstable ignores all the structural reasoning that Tom gives you, which is that a lot of actual currencies are also incredibly unstable as well, which means that if you're from one of these countries that has an unstable currency, having the choice between that currency that you probably don't trust in the first place and an alternative that you think is slightly better is probably a good thing. But even in their best case scenario, which is probably places like Australia, New Zealand, the US, governments also do relatively badly with the managing of those economies, right? They have no competition in terms of their economic knowledge. And this responds to what Bella asked, which is like, well, how does the RBA get materially better? It's when you have alternative currencies who are hedging against potential economic risks in different ways, you force the RBA to consider ways in which it might be dealing with the economy bad in the status quo, or could be doing it better. And that's how they get better. And any other central bank that you're talking about, aside from that, it's also that central banks currently have political incentives. And of course, not every country has like elected officials in like their central banking, but they often are appointed by politicians who do have elected incentives as well, and can be removed approved by them. So it means that they sometimes have an incentive not to do the thing that is absolutely best for their economy. So we don't even need to talk about just the worst cases, though I think we do win clearly on those worst cases when you actually have structural, like not even structural reasons why the economy is failing. It's just empirically failing, but also reasons why people might lose trust in the economies that are currently doing well in the status quo as well. But I think it's also incredibly important to note that crypto can regulate itself or is just not as unstable as they suggest. And I would just like to point out that a lot of the reasons why they give the crypto is unstable are kind of just like waving their hands and saying that it's spooky without actually providing any mechanization as to why it actually is. We tell you that you get increased competition between cryptocurrencies that mean that you prioritize stability. It means you get rid of scams at the point at which you have cryptocurrencies that have clear track records of increasing growth. And note, with the advent of this stuff, they're likely to proliferate even further, so that competition increases. Stuff like access to people's IP addresses means that it's not as easy to scam someone because you're just a bunch of numbers. Those numbers are inherently attached to your identity on the internet, and people can then track you if it occurs again. I also would note that this motion kind of assumes that this thing can occur in the first place. So Bella's push that the government won't let it happen is a bit ridiculous here. This competition will likely occur until it is proven to be bad. It won't be proven to be bad because it won't, but it will exist in the first place, and that competition will allow these problems to come down. But the second thing I will say is that people can totally choose how they buy into crypto, and the kind of idea that they can't is just bullshit, right? The argument the negative team is giving you is literally an argument as to why regular everyday people shouldn't be allowed to invest in the share market, right? Because stocks can go down and people can lose their money, and sometimes they don't understand. But we let them do it anyway because we believe that giving people the freedom to manage their own financial affairs is a good thing. And in this instance, when you have the proliferation of deregulated finance, you increase people's engagement and access when you have this proliferation from the status quo, right? You get people educating themselves, you get news articles explaining it, you get things like stablecoin, which is literally an alternative to Bitcoin, which is already pretty stable, but you have stable crypto things to engage the everyday person, because at the point at which you have the proliferation, you have the engagement and you have the will to do stuff like that as well. But notably, again, we are the side that give people the option to opt in, because under their side, they're like, you put your money in your Australian bank account. If you do not live in Australia, and if you live in a country that is significantly less economically stable, you put your money in the bank account of a country that could collapse, a bank that could close its doors to you and that you never get access to. Under our side, we give them the option to do it in crypto, and we make it safer because the proliferation of that means there is more competition. When that advent does not occur, they only have one option, and that option sucks. This also means that you get much greater investment in countries that companies might perceive to be unstable economically, because they feel as if they can put their money in somewhere that is not going to be stolen by the government if there is a hyperinflation situation or if there is like a run on the banks and stuff like that. At the end of this, we are the side that gives people the options. We are the side that stops people from having to be locked into situations with governments that cannot manage their economies. And for that reason, we are so proud to propose.
Posen, thank you very much for that speech. And to close the substantive portion of the debate, I'd like to welcome up the third negating speaker.
Hey, sorry, can you hear me? Okay, sorry, we're gonna be quiet. This affirmative case perfectly encapsulates why people believe in DeFi, why they invest so significantly in it despite the huge amount of risks that they know are involved in it, because they are thoroughly disillusioned with state control of currency. They think the Reserve Bank is a whole bunch of stupid people. They kind of look at this novel option and say, it has the promise to be free from all of this. They get totally sucked in. That was the type of vulnerable person that we actually protect. Because if you actually think about it, side opposition doesn't really center their case around the actual people that invest in crypto. Their best analysis is all along the lines of, this will promote engagement and competition for traditional finance. I think this is so weird. that they're just like, in many ways agree that this is kind of a scam, that crypto sucks, it's going to hurt people, they're going to lose money. But it's okay because people who do traditional finance now will have a better system. I think that's really backwards. I'm going to start with two less important things that are kind of irrelevant today. First is that argument about hedging. The hedging argument makes no sense for two reasons. The first is that cryptocurrencies rise and fall together. That is because if this is decentralized finance, your financial markets rely on other financial markets. If one coin has a really bad time, it has tremendous flow-on effects to a whole bunch of other coins. That is why the collapse of FTX led to a whole bunch of cryptocurrencies losing a huge amount of value. But it is because speculation of these crypto coins happens together. That is why they have boom and bust cycles, as we proved from first. But second, it is that cryptocurrency is tied to a real world currency. And this is the biggest reason why this argument makes no sense. The moment that the US increased interest rates, the value of crypto tanked. So if they care so much about hedging against inflation, guess what? Crypto is the worst place to hedge because it is the most acutely affected by real world currencies. And that is why this is just an illusion. It is literally a sales pitch for crypto all the time that you're hedging against real world currency. It's free from the influences of the Reserve Bank and fiat currency. It isn't. It's perfectly reliant on it, and that is why we think this denies individuals true ability to actually defend their own profits, their own hard-earned incomes. They fall for these tricks all the time. They lose a tremendous amounts of saving. This isn't hedging. This is firmly our case about why people get scammed. Second, they say this undermines US influence or whatever. Unclear whether this is the tipping point, but more importantly, like, we still have cryptocurrency as a store of value, right? Like, Bitcoin still exists under our side, and it's really unclear that the actual thing that is going to undermine US hegemony is the fact that you have decentralized derivatives markets now, just like not sufficiently explained for them to arrive at their impact. So what actually was important, two things in this debate. First is, our core case is that citizens suffer along the way, that they are pulled into these scams which genuinely devastate their quality of life. And there are four ways that we make this argument, and they just don't give a good enough response down the bench. First is that the vast majority of decentralized financial services are deliberately intended as a scam. We give you analysis straight from first why so many crypto products, but genuinely even well-intentioned coders often just get sucked in by the allure of significant amounts of profit, get well over their head like in FTX, where you get SBF who just doesn't know what they're doing, even though they genuinely believe in the crypto dream and genuinely want to provide a good market to people. That is why those products are unsustainable. That is why these financial services that they provide are significantly over-leveraged. They've taken on way too much debt. They are going to go bankrupt and lose a huge amount of people's money along the way. There were deliberate scams, even well-intentioned people, that even the most rational of consumers would struggle to identify. But even if that isn't true, and there are some decentralized financial products that aren't scams, why is it that the vast majority of citizens that engage in these products are just sufficiently not illiterate to engage rationally and therefore will lose money? And side opposition talks a lot about the like hey mum scam and like other forms of scams that exist. The problem is that in the crypto space, as we prove at first, there is a unique type of stakeholder that is preyed upon. And that is a stakeholder that is going through the Dunning-Kruger effect. They really think that they're a smart investor that's really savvy. They're relatively middle income. They're trying to invest in crypto. So they're genuinely trying to make money and they're trying to build up their income. They're not incredibly wealthy. And they just have a significant overconfidence because they've engaged somewhat, they've gotten a little bit of a sweet taste of some money from some successful coins, and then they get way over their head, they way overinvest in certain number of coins and lose all of it. And we think that is the type of person that is really sympathetic because they genuinely do try, they genuinely have some knowledge, they're just not sufficiently knowledgeable and they need protection. We think that those people are really important. The third thing is that even if, literally under their best case, they get a whole bunch of really consenting, rational people engaging in the crypto market, I'm just going to note that this is a really big even if, right? The vast majority on the crypto space don't walk in there like, perfectly clear-headed, like they're making good investments all the time. But even if that is true, you still need protection for these markets. There is a reason why the stock market is regulated. There's a reason why your foreign currency exchanges are regulated. That is because you do not want that foreign currency exchange doing anything with the amount of money that they're sitting on. You do not want them to just spend all that money and all of a sudden have a run on that exchange because it doesn't have money to give out to people. And this is the problem, that even if you are a rationing individual engaging in this environment, the fact that it is poorly regulated means that even if your individual product that you've invested in very smartly is sound financially, the fact that a whole bunch of idiots over there have invested in what is a scam, and your product is tangential or reliant on that product, that leads to huge external flow-on effects through these markets. That is why the financial markets are significantly regulated, because you have to have blanket regulations to prevent this type of chain reactions, this type of contagion. And this is something that, again, gets no response. Just the fact that inherently these places are designed to escape regulation, that inherently the government really struggles to regulate crypto well beyond the stock exchange because it just doesn't know enough about these institutions. So all of this means that even the smartest investors, even the most well-intentioned code writers that are creating these products still fail. And this is a problem that needs defense. The last is we just explained that crypto is inherently bad. It is built off speculation that makes it volatile, that it has no real world value, which means even in their literal best case where people invest in crypto, we think that is regrettable. Why is this the most important thing? First piece underweighing is I think that they literally use innocent civilians as a battering ram to improve traditional financial system. And we think that that is both on a moral level incorrect. Like that is literally saying that we support Optus getting hacked because it makes a whole bunch of other companies improve their cybersecurity. It's incredibly backwards, right? That people deserve to suffer to improve the traditional system. I don't think it's something that they can bite in the debate. But I think more problematically is there's just a number of reasons why their competition, let's engage more, has problems. First is they provide greater incentives to banks, right? They say in competition here, we'll push banks and we'll push these sectors to do better, but obviously their incentives are like incredibly significant already. Like what bank is just like, oh yeah, safety is not particularly important at the moment. We don't need trust in consumers. And this is the second problem, is they just use the word monopoly and say there is no competition, but like, there are a whole bunch of national stock exchanges. If you think that one stock exchange is being particularly predatory or isn't unsafe, you go to another one. And the same is true for banks. Like, yes, banks are national monopolies, but there's still heaps of banks. There's still a bunch of countries with different banks. It's just like competition isn't zero under our side. So they need to prove why this is a significant novel form of competition rather than just saying it's more competition. And this is where they really fail, because crypto uniquely is a meaningless form of competition. That is because no one trusts it. No one actually buys into it. The number of people that engage in this decentralized finance is so much lower. So banks don't internalize crypto as a threat. They don't see it as a big pressure that makes them need to improve. And the last response is this threat even a good thing? I would posit that if people are earning high rates of profit on decentralized finance, what this forces is small banks who actually attract individuals through high rates of interest rates to literally go under, because they can't compete with decentralized finance, which is scamming people with high interest rates and the promise of that. And now they're losing a whole bunch of customers and a whole bunch of people that they just can't sustain. So I just don't understand, if they believe that this is a scam and it's unsustainable, they lose the debate because it is actually a bad incentive for banks.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now, as is customary, we reverse the speaking order in half speaking times, and I'd like to welcome back up the leader of the negating team to deliver the reply.
This has been a confusing debate because financial literacy turns out it's pretty complicated. But this is an affirming team that skips the mechanizing grunt work, which they have to do by the rules of debating, and moves straight to impacting, and then refuses to engage with pushes from every speaker in the neg bench to actually perform that mechanization. So what I'm going to do in this reply is try to inject some clarity. I'm going to discuss their main win strategies, and then I'm going to weigh it against ours, explain what ours is more important. Their first, main, and I think their core strategy, if they don't get it, it's unclear they win, is competition. And we have numerous responses to this. The first is, I guess, there's very little fleshing out throughout the affirmative bench of what the end impacts of competition look like. I think the best picture you get is hedging, which is, you better able to plan to make sure financial risk is dispersed. But as we explained, the systems that decentralized finance uses are affected by real-world financial systems and are themselves not independent of their movement with one another, which explains why they're particularly bad for use as an agent of hedging. They do not deliver the benefit of giving, any more hedging against financial risk. But we also point out there's a capacity problem, which they also appear to agree. Financial systems are pretty hard to regulate because they are labyrinthine, because they are somewhat tyrannical in their construction. And there's very little explanation of why competition is a thing that fixes that kind of capacity problem. What capacity does it additionally provide that financial systems are competing with one another? I would contest it doesn't provide any information. In fact, it just provides confusion. Thirdly, these systems are absolutely zero capacity for regulation because there's no competition laws, there's no like a person you can attach it to for regulation. Clearly, they're poorer than like the ASX for things like regulation. But fourthly, there's no reason you can't have like national stock exchanges competing with one another for the exact benefit that they care about, which is something we provide you, Eugene. Then they move on briefly in Ali's speech to what they believe is a cheap hit. So by the way, they don't get competition. Is a cheap hit that you're going to break down US dollar hegemony through this. Obviously, there's very little tipping point analysis from the affirmative team about how that happens. Like, these are very entrenched systems. They need to provide a lot of analysis. I don't think they do. But it's implausible because of the setup which we provide, which is that decentralized finance is not the same as creating alternative stores of currency that would provide that check on the US dollar hegemony. Things like Bitcoin, things like Ethereum, you can do those kinds of things without decentralized finance. You don't grapple with the unique elements of DeFi that would produce this. So unclear, both teams can't claim that. Then I think the end of this reply is just clear. They have a pretty implausible response to our central win strategy, which is that because this is definitionally both abstract and complex and definitionally has very little accountability, there are a set of people who are vulnerable to Ponzi schemes that are set out to essentially exploit them and take money. They're vulnerable because they think they're financially knowledgeable, when in fact they are not. There's very little incentive for people not to do this. There's every incentive for people to exploit it because there's absolutely no accountability. Jordyn spends 2 minutes of her second affirmative speech comically describing how like telephone scams work. Like the existence of telephone scams does not disprove the fact that more intelligent, financially literate people cannot be financially exploited. Provide extensive examples of how people do that. Like if your argument is just scams don't happen, the real world, things the average reasonable voter would have read in the news disprove that. Honestly, like if you believe they get their entire case, it's actually just not as important as like hundreds of millions of people losing lots of their net worth because they invest in schemes where they lose all their money, right? Like that impact and throwing all of those people on the altar of, in the future, this might stabilize and check systems through competition is not worth those vulnerable people who, you know, get in over their head and lose all their money. Negative team have a clear strategy to win vote.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that speech. And to close debate, I'd like to welcome up the leader of the affirming team to deliver the affirming reply.
It's nice that Oscar thinks that they have a clear win condition, but at the end of that reply, I still don't understand if this negative team thinks that cryptocurrency is or is not part of decentralized finance and this debate, because they talk a lot about Bitcoin scams, but then they say in setup and at reply that Bitcoin and stores of value are not the same as decentralized finance. So it does not make sense. They fail to prove that cryptocurrency scams are currently or could ever become a significant part of how people lose their money to scams compared to other things that I described in my speech very seriously and not comically. The second thing that they fail to do is explain how this motion means that those cryptocurrency scams become worse, more predatory, more people lose their money to them in any way. The third thing is that they fail to respond to the mechanisms that we give you, which explain how competition incentivizes exchanges and banks to improve their security, reducing the number of data breaches that occur, and thus reducing the prevalence of all scams across the entirety of an economy. So if you cared about scams, that was good. The last push that they give you is the idea that it's just so impossible to understand cryptocurrency, people will fall prey to Ponzi scams. But I just think this is very silly because people often don't truly understand the exact details of things like stocks. But imagine being so foolish as to believe something like only USU graduates have the knowledge to be able to invest in the stock market or something like that. Clearly, we accept a lower amount of knowledge, but also, how is it that this person who doesn't know very much is even opting into the exchanges that this team thinks are part of the debate? anyway. I just don't understand it, don't think they get it. Let's talk a little bit now about burdens. Bella spends a decent amount of her third affirmative or third negative speech talking about choice, but they are the team that locks people into no choice, because in most of the world, you do not have a choice of national exchanges. Maybe that's the case in, say, the US, but it is not the case anywhere else. The important thing to understand is that they lock people in systems of hyperinflation and mismanagement. Imagine being somebody from Venezuela or from Zimbabwe. That person would probably far prefer to opt into something like a stable coin or like a cryptocurrency exchange, because they certainly would not trust the exchanges operated by their governments in that instance. This team gives them no choice whatsoever. And I would suggest even a relatively bad exchange or a relatively early exchange would be better than the options they give. The last thing that they do is they have this silly thing about the material we give you at Tom's speech and again at Ali's speech, where it's clearly impacted, about US hegemony. They're like, oh, you don't prove a tipping point. But this wasn't about changing the entirety of the financial system. It was explaining that we reduce the unfair advantage that American firms have that they use to crush domestic firms. That is clearly still a benefit and something that can be weighed in this debate, something that affected the most vulnerable people. They needed to do more than just saying we didn't have a tipping point, we didn't need one. We reduced the scale of the harm. That's another way that one could and probably is currently winning debates. Let's talk then about improving the system. Importantly, this team doesn't seem to understand the way that competition works in the slightest, because we explain at the base level, this looks like exchanges competing with one another, and they're competing to do things like gain the share of highly informed users who are even aware that these exchanges exist. So you're trying to gain a greater share of like crypto bros and high-risk hedge funds. This is set out so clearly in my speech. And then over time, you consolidate and develop these things such that they can become a credible competitive force to established exchanges, but they can only do that, and note that they haven't achieved it yet. But in the future, they would only be able to do that if they had a legitimately very good system that had strong buy-in from this highly informed user base. This team is like, ordinary people will buy into FDX. Why? They never explain it. They don't explain how those people even know about those exchanges. It doesn't make any sense. Probably not to the extent that they do. It's probably not very much money that they put into it. But at the end of this process, what does happen is a competitor to those established exchanges starts to emerge or does emerge. And either that prompts those established exchanges to improve their security and their efficiency, or they simply get replaced. And that is a good thing, because it gives people better access to secure transactions. It means that you unlock the ability to invest in contexts where government-operated exchanges are incredibly unreliable. That's deeply important for poor people who saw their money decrease over years through inflation. And obviously, this meant that we could have far more effective and accessible markets that mattered very deeply and created fewer data breaches that could be used to exploit the most vulnerable. For those reasons, we take this debate.
Perfect. Thanks everyone for what was a great debate. I'll give one piece of general feedback, then the result and reasoning for decision. In terms of general feedback, I think one thing that slightly made this debate a little bit messier than it needed to be was discussion around kind of what decentralized financial systems are involved. I think by the end of the debate, both teams did give characterizations of both like decentralized financial systems involving like just cryptocurrencies or also like, you know, different stock exchanges, things like that. But I think kind of more clarity around how different areas in the debate would be impacted or would impact those areas of a decentralized financial system probably would have made impacts a little bit cleaner for both teams. So I think that's something to work on. In terms of the result, the panel was unanimous and we awarded this debate to the affirming team. So congratulations and commiserations to the negating team. I think this debate broadly came down to two main clashes. Firstly, whether these decentralized financial systems improve financial systems at large or provided some sort of unique benefit. And then secondly, who invested in these systems and the uptake and what the scope for vulnerable people to kind of suffer and be victim to scams would be. In terms of that first issue on what these decentralized financial systems look like and how they impact financial systems at large, the affirming team sets up, I think, what is quite a good problem in this debate, which is that current financial systems are imperfect and that government-regulated financial systems have really strong incentives to not either have the capacity to fix that behavior or to behave in ways that might impact the people engaging with those systems. So that's things like political and electoral incentives, often meaning that the economy can take a hit if that's something that is like really politically appealing. Things like even economists themselves having a lack of understanding, but importantly, things like lack of competition, meaning that things like fees can be really high. The impact of all of this is that people currently are at risk of economic systems not behaving well. And I think the reason why that's important for the affirming team in this debate is that they're able to demonstrate that the current system does have some unique risks that lie with it. That is things like when economic shocks happen, people can lose their money, lose their jobs. And I think where they're able to extend the impact of this harm is by demonstrating the link that has in countries that may not have typically reliable centralized banking or exchanges, where those fluctuations can mean that living with hyperinflation just is the norm, and people get locked into those systems and don't have any choice or ability to opt out. And I think that principle of choice is kind of downstream of that impact, and that's how it's measured in the debate. The problem for the negating team then on this issue is that I don't necessarily think they're able to engage with the fact that the existing status quo is imperfect for a large number of people beyond just accepting that these imperfections are kind of part and parcel of the problem. I think the issue that runs into is that the affirming team is able to claim a number of benefits that would stand in a vacuum where these systems are introduced. That is to say that these decentralized financial systems are likely to be less prone to things like political capture. And I think what's especially harmful for the negating team here is that this is a unique mechanism that helps people that may not have access to things like multiple stock exchanges in a country or have a really weak currency that is prone to fluctuation. So I think when evaluating these kind of decentralized financial systems in that vacuum, it is a good thing to support the advent insofar as they're providing people with these benefits, even if that doesn't necessarily change the behavior of institutional actors. And I'll kind of go into that competition mechanism below, but just as a starting point, I think the affirming team is able to demonstrate that these decentralized financial systems give people an option that would improve their ability to access finance, things like that. Then in terms of who's actually able to engage with these systems and what the scope is for vulnerable people to suffer here, the negating team argues that effectively these kind of things can operate as scams where people are trying to get rich quick. I think the better conception that comes down the line is to suggest that the vast majority of harm occurs when people believe they understand the way that these systems work and go all in on it, but the inherently unpredictable and volatile nature means that people lose their money, and that has all of the devastating harms when people go all in on that. I think the problem for the negating team here is that I wanted the negating team to show why these things, why, for example, the advent of decentralized financial systems would increase the propensity of scams, for example, because I think to the extent that the group of people they discuss are people that are already engaging with cryptocurrency, to shift the margin in that debate, that requires showing why that group necessarily increases. And I don't think the negating team does the work to demonstrate why these programs get worse. Comparatively, I think what the affirming team is able to do is do quite a good job of showing that for the initial uptake of these more complex systems, that often will be restricted to people who either relatively understand or know the lingo enough to opt into these things and have capacity to take on risk, or are just people that opt into risk in general, are able to hedge on those things. I think the negating team struggles in responding to why it is the case that these are likely going to be the people that engage in the first place. The impact that that has is that insofar as I believe that victims of crypto scams are currently a group that already exists in the debate and the negating team is not able to increase that group, immediately those benefits that the affirming team brings up in that first point become more important. Where the negating team is able to narrow this margin slightly in the debate is when they discuss the affirming team's kind of lack of analysis around how these systems grow from this initial stage where these institutional investors are the ones that are kind of moving finance into decentralized financial systems. I think what this does is it mitigates the extent of the benefit that the affirming team is able to claim to completion, but I don't necessarily think it flips the benefit for the negating team either, to the extent that I would award the clash to them. The reason for that is that I do believe that the affirming team takes reasonable efforts to demonstrate the large majority of initial users are people that can cop the risk. On that basis, these platforms at worst become self-sufficient, meaning there is no harm. But I think they are able to further demonstrate that these institutions taking investors away at the very least may encourage existing financial systems to do things like reduce fees or increase security, or at the very least provide options for those people that I believe under the status quo are stuck with bad currencies. that benefit is enough to win this debate. But I think on top of that, the affirming team is able to set up like kind of the risk of disillusionment as an existing framing, meaning that there are a group of people that are likely to opt in at the stage where these become viable options. If I believe their analysis that these institutional investors are likely to be the first ones to put their money behind these systems, then I think there is scope for this competition to increase in the future, improving both these decentralized financial systems, but also existing ones that people have their money tied into. And that's why the affirming team is able to take the debate.